Good morning, everybody. My name is Kiki Mordi, and I'm a journalist. Now, that should not be a crime, obviously, but sometimes it feels like. According to an ICFJ and UNESCO survey conducted in 2020, nearly 3 in 4 women journalists experience online violence in the course of their work. Now, these threats are threats of physical violence and sexual violence that has plagued the women surveyed at 25 and 18% respectively. I work as a freelance investigative journalist, and in 2020, when the inevitable trolling happened, I stood alone against the storm. I personally had to filter through thousands of online hate messages to figure out which ones would find their ways to actual physical violence. Now, violence against journalists is not new, neither is violence against women, or even violence against women journalists. But this unchecked violence has become viral in the digital age and has been exacerbated not only by political antagonists who feel it, but by big tech's failure to stem the hate at the source. And then there is also the media, employers, who don't do enough to care for the women journalists that they hire. In this session, we'll discuss two new reports from the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO, drawn from their global study about online violence against women journalists. We'll assess how news organizations are responding to the crisis and ask, what more can they practically do? This panel consists of spectacular individuals who have been victims of online violence themselves. And the big question today is, how are newsrooms responding to online violence against women journalists? Our first speaker is Dr. Julie Posetti. She is the Deputy Vice President for Global Research for the ICFJ. She's a feminist journalist and academic who has experienced her fair share of online hate and led the study at the center for this panel discussion. It's so great to have you on the panel today. Our second speaker is Carmen Aristegui. She is an anchor of the news program Aristegui on CNN Español. Carmen is widely regarded as one of Mexico's leading journalists and opinion leader, and is best known for her critical investigation of the Mexican government. Next on the big screen, we have Glenda Gloria. She's the executive editor of Rappler. Rappler has been a trailblazing digital news outlet that has stood up to the Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, which she co-founded with Nobel laureate Maria Ressa. And finally, we have Branko Brkic, editor-in-chief of South Africa's daily Maverick. He's the only man on the panel, but as you'll soon hear, he understands how misogyny plays a role in the attack against journalists. Before we begin, I would like to invite on stage Dr. Tawfik Jelassi. He's the Assistant Director General for Communications and Information at UNESCO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiki. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning for this special session on online violence against women journalists in the context of our World Press Freedom Day and conference here in Punta del Este. I'm pleased to welcome you to this session co-organized with the International Center for Journalists on this and cover this urgent, important issue. I would like to thank Julissa Mantilla, President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, for her presence with us today. The alarm regarding the specific risks faced by women journalists in relation to their work is mentioned in several resolutions of the United Nations, including resolutions made by UNESCO General Conference, the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and regional bodies. These resolutions underline the importance of taking a gender-responsive approach when considering measures to analyze and address the safety of journalists and the safety of women journalists. Over the last 2 years, UNESCO has been collaborating with the International Center for Journalists on landmark global study on online violence against women journalists. A discussion paper drawing on this study, and you saw the cover page of this discussion paper here, entitled "The Chilling Global Trends in Online Violence Against Women Journalists." This paper was released last year and received some attention worldwide by several important media outlets. This discussion paper shed light on how online violence, described as the new front line in journalism safety, how it poses special risk to women journalists. They are subject not only to disinformation campaigns and efforts to discredit their work, but also face gender-based attacks, including network misogyny and threats of sexual and physical violence. Let me here briefly mention 2 specific examples covered in this report. The first one is about a prominent journalist, Maria Ressa, who received last year in Namibia the World Press Freedom Award by UNESCO and the Guillermo Cano Foundation. And as you know, also Maria Ressa received last fall the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize along with Dmitry Muratov. The case of Maria Ressa is explored in depth in the forthcoming global study, which describes the orchestrated attacks leading her to suffer various arrest warrants, detentions, and even a conviction, all because she was practicing her profession. Moreover, these attacks have led to incredible psychological stress, which is actually the case of many women journalists facing online violence or even physical violence to that matter. The big data study, which we conducted in the framework of this global study, covers hundreds of thousands of tweets, posts, and comments, which were directed at Maria Ressa over the course of 12 months. It demonstrates how attacks against her intersected with various parts of her identity, the color of her skin, her religion, her nationality, and also her sexuality. This aspect characterizes online attacks against many women journalists worldwide. The importance of dealing with such violence is being increasingly acknowledged. However, newsrooms already have an immediate and direct role to play in preventing online attacks, in protecting women journalists, and in supporting them, including through legal assistance or strategic litigation. The second case I would like to briefly mention is the case of the UK journalist Carol Cadwallader. The Guardian Media Group took legal action to shut down a website publishing fake Guardian headlines targeting journalists, including Carol herself. However, the media outlet did not fund her defense in her ongoing defamation cases, which have been causing great burden for the journalists. Clearly, the responsibility of newsrooms is still too often subject to interpretation. However, the discussion paper of last year highlighted the need, as expressed by women journalists themselves, for newsrooms to take a more effective action. This is something that must be done. The full report recommendations will explore this matter at different levels, from leadership to policies to response mechanism, calling for a change of what is often described as a macho newsroom culture. Women journalists are fighting back, and they need the full support. They need our full support different actors have to combat online violence against them. This implies not only newsrooms, but also lawmakers, internet companies, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and of course, civil society as well. I can assure you that UNESCO will continue to work with all stakeholders on this very important matter and will do our very best to find solutions to this crisis. It is my hope to see the recommendations of the upcoming global study be implemented by all concerned actors. This is absolutely necessary to ensure a safer environment for women journalists, allowing them the safety and the freedom to properly conduct their important work. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to invite Her Excellency, Julissa Mantilla Falcón, the President of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start saying thank you to the UNESCO and all the organizers and to all the marvelous women here. And as always, I have all my paper here and all the information about this important topic about how to, how to combat this online violence against women. But I think I don't need a paper now to make a question, How many men we have in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why? Is this a topic only of women? Because we all women, and this is this magnificent, marvelous women here, we all know what's going on with our life. We all know about gender violence. We all know about harassment, sexual harassment, labor harassment. We all know about rape. We all know about being a journalist in your case or being a lawyer and have to show that you can control your emotions, you can be as strong as a man, you have to, and when you denounce harassment, everybody told you, what did you do? Maybe your fault. So since we all women know about that, it will be great to have more men here to learn about that. And this is the first thing that I would like to say. This report, that is a new report, is a new report about all issues and issues that happen all the time. And I'd like to mention a previous report for 2020. This is a report where they ask women a poll about how they feel about violence online when they were working. And 73% of these 625 women that they say that they suffer violence online while they were working. From these women, only 25% make a complaint. And when they make a complaint in front of their employers, they say 10% they didn't say it at all. The bosses didn't say anything. Or the other answers were, and I quoted, "Come on, don't be so sensitive. Come on, you have to be more strong if you want to be a journalist." Or 2% say, "Maybe you provoked that. Have you reflect about your behavior?" And this is the first thing. And the other thing of this poll is about the impact. 30% of these women, they say that they decide to keep quiet because of this attack. 20% of these women say that they stop with their Twitters, Facebooks, Instagrams, interactions. And 11% start quitting the job, and even some of them decide to quit journalism. So when you, in this event and in all days, we start asking, what can we do to stop this? the first question is to start caring about this. And I hope UNESCO and the Inter-American Commission, we can talk more about that and start making the tools and the development to improve this situation. And the other thing is that from the Inter-American Commission, with I'm the president, but also the women's rapporteur, we, of course, recognize the particularities of the violence against journalists. But we cannot forget that it's a continuous of gender discrimination, continuous of sexual harassment. Because, as I was commenting with my colleagues, a women journalist, she's going to suffer harassment when she's working as a journalist. But it doesn't stop the harassment that she suffers when she's taking public transportation, or the rape, or the insults, or the comment about their clothes or their style. So if we don't start thinking this violence, online violence, as part of a whole context of gender violence, we are going to have more reports, more laws, more actions, but we are going to ask why these things don't change. From the Freedom of Expression rapporteur, that Pedro Bach is there, we have several reports on that. I know I have a few minutes, so I don't want to pass, but I want to mention one. 2018, we have this report about women, journalists, and freedom of expression, and we start to analyze all these factors and the impact on the work of women. And this year, 2022, we're going to have a special chapter in the annual report on this situation and a special chapter of the role of women in media and working in journalism and suffering harassment there. A few recommendations, I can have more, but I'm going to few. First of all, the situation of harassment and violence against women is a human rights violation. Second of all, the answer should include a state, but not only a state, because if we keep raising children with this idea that women have to obey, has to be more, delicate, and they cannot afford some spaces, this is going to continue. When you ask why there are not more women directing journalists or having these roles, why? Ask women and listen to them. Countries in the region where women, for instance, don't have the control about the sexual and reproductive rights, women that are raped, then they don't have information about sexual and reproductive health, they cannot control that. And are you expecting as well to be a journalist and direct media and to have all the power that we never receive? Give me a break. So it's the obligations, it's principle of no discrimination, and have this different view of women, indigenous women, Afro women, women with disability, trans women, older women, girls, And the other thing is very important. It's not enough to have more law. The problem is not the law. The problem is how to implement this law, how to start changing the speech. When women, and I'm going to close with this, for instance, and we're talking about freedom of expression, after years of abuses, women decide to, me too, to start denouncing in Facebook, Twitter. What was the answer? To complain, judicial complaints against women. So it's when you were violated, the law didn't protect. But when you decide to denounce after 10 or 20 years, the law is the tool for coming back to you instead of the aggressor. And I think, and I'm finishing with this is a work of the whole society. It's not enough to have a gender editor in all the media. It's not enough to have a gender workshop. And I dared with that, it's a whole commitment. It's a matter of justice. But above all, is to understand The women, we are not asking for favors. We are asking for justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency. Very, very powerful indeed. So right into the panel. Julie, you led this report. What are the most critical findings and recommendation from the new research in your view?
Sure. Can we have the slides? I have a microphone.
Can we have the slides?
Can we have the slides up, please? Because
Okay.
I want to speak to those. Yes, in fact, if we can just go back one, please. Today we are launching actually 2 new reports from this global study, which are now on the screen. We heard about 2 other reports from the Chilling, which came out in 2020 and 2021. Today we're able to bring you fresh off the presses 2 chapters from the forthcoming book about this theme, which we've worked on for the past 2.5 years. One is about newsroom responses, which will be framing the discussion that we're about to have. And I say newsroom responses and the lack of newsroom responses and the problematic newsroom responses, but also what opportunities exist to really respond to the call we just heard from Her Excellency, which I applaud. We also have another report or chapter from the forthcoming book on the platform's responses. And these 2 key responders, and in the case of the platforms, vectors and facilitators of online violence, are intertwined. So we need to consider both of these. So Kiki, to come to your question, given the focus on newsrooms, I'll start there. One of the key findings is the need to recognise the trauma and the mental health crisis, the psychological injury, which is often dismissed as not being physical, but which is every bit as physical for many women, as one of our research subjects said, as being kicked in the shin, as being slapped in the face. It is a very physical experience to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, because your daily work is filled with hate, with threats of violence, with threats of rape. And horrifically, as we found in countries from Northern Ireland through to Mexico, we found women's children being threatened with rape, women journalists' children. There was also an example from the US. I mean, this radiates this horror. And so it is a workplace safety issue as much as it is a workplace safety issue to provide your war correspondents with a flak jacket. It is important to prepare and to protect your journalists, particularly your women journalists, as our research has shown, who are so much more vulnerable to attack. And the scale of such attacks can be just intense and mountainous. And so on top of that, there needs to be a better approach to identifying the imminent threat of online attacks. There needs to be a better understanding of how to prepare for lightning rod stories, as we call them. So we found, for example, that reporting on gender, reporting on rape, reporting on domestic violence, this was the #1 thematic trigger for an online pile-on against a woman journalist, which will come as no surprise to most of the women in the room. Politics, migration, disinformation reporting, these were other issues that attracted significant online attacks against women journalists, which include not just hate speech, because it is hate speech. Misogyny is just as much about hate as racism is about hate. And there's one thing we need to understand and to respond to. And at the newsroom level, that should be integrated into the policies, guidelines and responses to gender-based or to online violence per se. Another statistic from our study, which is really alarming, is that for 20% of the women we surveyed, they experienced offline harassment, attacks and abuse that they said was connected to online violence. So we are now seeing a pattern which involves a trajectory from online attacks against women journalists to offline attacks against women journalists. And unfortunately, we've already seen two high-profile cases which we can draw attention to in this regard. One is the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, and the other is the murder of Gauri Lankesh in India. Both of those women suffered extreme online violence before they were murdered in cold blood. And Maria Ressa, who was mentioned earlier, her legal counsel told us for our research, as did Daphne Caruana Galizia's family members, that they feared for her life because they saw her being attacked in the same ways that Daphne and Gauri were attacked. And this becomes a really important point of action for news organisations. It must be taken into account to prepare for offline attacks, whether that be stalking, right through to physical or sexual violence, in any kind of plan that regards journalism safety. So as you heard, only a quarter of the women journalists who was surveyed by ICFJ and UNESCO said that they had reported online violence to their employers. That speaks volumes about the risks that they feel they have to take to actually even raise attention. And this is very much linked to structural sexism within the newsrooms, without wanting to feel that they're drama prone or they're too emotional or they're too weak. All of this is deeply problematic. And as you heard from Her Excellency, 10% said their employer did nothing at all in response to their concerns, and 2% were asked, with echoes of historic reactions and unfortunately current reactions to sexual violence in the physical realm, they were asked what they did to provoke the attacks, which leads to another key finding and recommendation, which is the need for social media policies that are not punitive, that do not punish women journalists for speaking back to their attackers, do not restrict the speech of women journalists when they're under attack. We found examples, really traumatic examples for us even to uncover, of women journalists in the midst of horrific attacks, and this was Western newsrooms as well as newsrooms in the Global South, being disciplined, being moved into backroom jobs, taken offline for a period of time, being suspended from duty, and in some cases even sacked because they dared to speak back and theoretically brought the organisation into disrepute. I mean, so much of this is drawing on language that feminists are well familiar with, but this is what they experienced. So we need social media policies in newsrooms that not just require responsible conduct of employees, but policies that specifically promise to advocate and support particularly women journalists and particularly women who suffer other forms of discrimination at the intersection of misogyny, that they are appropriately supported. And this does come down to a combination of gender sensitivity and a more nuanced understanding of what press freedom and freedom of expression really mean in public communication. We need very much to urgently address, as I highlighted, this mental health crisis. Only 7 women that we surveyed said that they had been offered counselling or some kind of psychological support, despite the fact that the survey respondents identified mental health impacts as the most significant effect of their exposure to online violence. So we need protocols that are integrated, that offer good social and psychological support. We also need public advocacy. One of the really dominant responses from the 182 women journalists and experts we interviewed in addition to this survey that we're talking about, talked about the need for public support from their editors, putting out statements of support, standing up to the attackers, reinforcing their faith in the journalism that is being practiced by those journalists. To do so helps boost the credibility and sends a message to the attackers, who frequently tag women journalists' employers in a bid to expose them to censure, to expose them to potentially the loss of their job. Because the aim is to silence, this is really important. But the final, well, let me just say, disinformation is another gap that we identified, that is responding to disinformation in the context of gender-based online violence. So 41% of the women we surveyed, the women journalists, said that they had experienced online violence that they believe was part of an orchestrated disinformation campaign. Most of them said that they were being targeted firstly and foremostly because they were journalists, secondly because they were women, and thirdly, usually because of the experience of layered discrimination, so this intersectional exposure. And the two areas, in addition to the sort of failure to address mental health issues and the sort of speech policing that's going on in newsrooms in reference to women journalists' responses, were about news organisations' failures to appropriately adapt policies and procedures where they do exist to address women of colour, gay, bisexual and trans women, also women suffering extreme religious bigotry. So these were some of the key gaps that we've made recommendations, practical recommendations to respond to, and we can come back to those at the end. But the final point is that there is, despite all of this, really only so much that news organisations can do when the platforms have failed so dismally to stem the hate at the core and have failed to take responsibility for being the vectors that they are for this problem. And when so many of the antagonists are senior political figures, including prime ministers and presidents, including other political actors. And so this is a holistic response that's required. We can't just put the blame on newsrooms for failing to protect journalists. This is a whole of society issue, as has been said. And so just to bring one point to the fore, how we respond to this now is critical. And at ICFJ, in direct response to one of the preliminary recommendations from the chilling, the overall study, which was to develop an early warning system to help predict and monitor and then ultimately prevent the escalation of online violence into offline harm, with the cooperation of the UK government. We're in the process of developing a set of tools, a set of interactive tools and a dashboard to assist with journalists where they are, where they're working online, as a way of trying to escalate the assistance that they need and to escalate to the platforms. So I'll leave it there, but plenty to unpack.
Thank you very much. The early warning system can't come fast enough, really. Some of the things that stood out from what you said: recognize the trauma, identify the threats, don't punish women journalists for speaking up, and publicly advocate against whatever disinformation campaign that your female journalist is experiencing. So Carmen, you are one of the most prominent, most respected journalists in Mexico. But taking it back to 2015, you yourself were sort of a victim of this. You were fired from MVS Radio 102.5 FM in Mexico City following an expose on the corruption by the then Mexican president. Can you take us through what happened and how you responded?
Gracias por la invitación a este panel, Julie, Kiki.
For the invitation to this panel, Julie, Kiki, and everyone here meeting today in a day like today's, May 3, World Press Day, for a Mexican journalist like myself to talk about digital violence may be complex. If we observe that a country like mine, and like other countries, have experienced criminal violence against a lot of journalists. We are speaking here of a country that, according to Article 19, has had 153 murders, assassinations, just to mention a figure. Other organizations think there are more, but we say at least 153 journalists were assassinated in Mexico in the last years, 12 of which were women. We are talking about criminal violence that is very hard and that is tied to impunity, almost total impunity. So in the face of a reality like this, to discuss other types of violence may sound complex, but it should be done because no type of violence can be admitted. And because one type of violence leads to other types that can cost even the lives of people. So this panel is so important, and that's why Julie's work and all the experts' work is so important, because they are inquiring and they are asking, they're presenting understandings for a phenomenon like this. For us journalists who have lived through diverse phenomena like what Kiki was mentioning about my career, have been related to censorship, have been related to loss of communication spaces, vetoes from the editors, judicial harassment, litigations, and search warrants for our newsrooms. Just to mention a few things that over the years we have experienced as independent journalists, a group of independent journalists as I am part of. These type of things that we have experienced through the years in Mexico have different connotations. Litigations, absurd litigations, fighting in court, surprised because your newsroom has been robbed, broken into, and to defend yourself from censorship, open your spaces on internet. All those stories add up over the years, and they add up to violence against journalists. So when we look at this other type of violence that gets diluted and is expressed through social media and the digital world, it's a different world. There are different tools you can use to defend yourself, and they can be scarce or none at all. In our case, we suffered absurd accusations and we had to fight in court, and you find lawyers and you can win a litigation. That's a type of defense. But if you have a situation where through your journalistic work you have lost your job, and you've been removed from your job, and nobody else in the country wanted to hire you again because of a veto that lasted the whole administration of government administration, you can build your own room, your own space to put on a fight. There's some kind of defense that you can interpret and find. But when you deal with violence like digital violence, where the common characteristics is anonymous attacks, and an important part of these campaigns that it can initiate at a certain place and then you lose track, and it can be an attack against yourself personally, your identity, your reputation. You can observe very clearly, as experts have pointed out and the data scientists have explained, there is an induction, there is a phenomenon when this is not just people who are attacking directly a journalist, but a whole machinery, technological machinery that is being used, is being paid to annihilate someone, to destroy someone morally, so that that reputation, that name, the prestige of that person as a journalist, that public figure can be damaged from a point of view where the person has no defense, as we could probably have in other realms.
because the response, the direct response with a answer from the affected journalist is very complicated, because one may need to be involved in an unending battle which may be ever lasting, and you try to respond with words in a circuit where it's not clear who is a person and who is a bot. And it's very clear when there's a scientific study behind. You can see the graphs that are incredible, where you can see these phenomena of attacks on social media, and you can see the graphs that are designed and appear, and they talk about when it's an organic conversation and when it's a directed campaign through bots and these surveillance and technology tools. So when does the government have to be involved? Congress, how do they act? Can they do something when it's directed, induced, that impacts negatively and harmful to the conversation, the social conversation? This is not we're not going to have the answer here, because this is an open conversation. During the opening presentation of this conference, the president of Uruguay, he said this isn't, we're going to say no, we have questions. If you can intervene in different conferences, we can have new law, we can try and direct the social conversation, but it's a dangerous conversation for a democracy. There is nothing that we can do because it will affect our freedom of speech. We don't want to affect free press, but we do need to discuss what Julie was saying, that need for a response. What responsibility do platforms have? Do the giant tech companies have when there is this induction towards this guided towards hatred? When there is a climate of hatred, of litigation against people, and this is the context where we need to discuss when there are actions that are directed or artificial actions where we should have a social conversation between human beings who need to discuss in whatever context they want to. We need to be able to talk as strongly as possible if it has to be an argument. But when there is a deliberate choice to create a hatred discourse, a climate of hatred, of moral hatred towards people, that's when the government, society, the media, the world needs to actually discuss, become involved about what can be done to slow down this process, to eliminate this process that is negative for democracy. This has to. We need to contemplate the respect for rights, human rights, and for freedom. We need to contemplate the specific needs that are financed and guided from certain circuits that are identifiable by experts, which are damaging our society's conversation. In this context, where there's a polarization that has been induced and a polarization that is also genuine, that is where there's the intersection and where the framework where violence against women is contextualized. And it is there where we have to find the way out so that what is supposed to be a powerful tool for society isn't necessarily a tool that is harmful for society. I don't want to be a purist or moralist or anything like that. What I want to say is that these tools that are so important and have changed the paradox of communication and the way we do communicating in the world, they need to help the world. They need to be useful for democracy. They need to be used by citizens to obtain power against, because citizen power, it has an enormous strength that it goes beyond democracy and civilizations. We need to rescue this tool that should empower people and citizens, and talk about this, and talk about responsibility of the great big companies who administer and who have business and dealings with millions of people's information. We need to discuss, and the congresses and states and the governments, they need to discuss a focalized conversation on that which is harmful for democracies, that which is harmful for true freedom of expression and freedom of press. And that is where we can contextualize violence against women and women journalists. And this is very clear. It can be identified. We've seen these new chapters of this report. It sheds the light. What's been shown by Julie and the team behind this paper, we've been able to see put faces and names to these experiences, seeing what's happening every day in many places around the world, all over the world, women journalists who, for simply doing their job, investigating, researching, criticizing, communicating, they are victims, we are victims of a specific type of violence and harassment that is focused on their sexuality, on their hatred, on trying to eliminate morally their prestige, their name, and their identity. And it's this specific, the characteristics of this violence against women. In those papers, you will see the recommendations. It's great because it talks about what needs to be done, or what can we expect our platforms that administer and do business with these services of communicating horizontally with millions of people. We need to demand a certain actions that impedes, that it doesn't enable this induction of hate, the use of artificial bots. And this is the discussion that we need to have. Yes, we do need to have those measures need to be put in place. The essence itself of communication between people. What this study also states are the recommendations that involves newsrooms and media companies and what can be done from their side. I liked what Julie mentions, and the study reports how the media, newspapers, TV, the spaces where journalists are working, we should have a clear concept that something can be done. If there is a direct campaign against one women journalist, and that campaign is clear that it arose as in a response to her journalistic work, the newsroom should have a public response in defense of her work and her person. In certain occasions, there is a gender-based space. We were talking with a colleague earlier, having a kind of bureaucratic response. Yeah, the company needs to have a gender desk, and would deal if that was as if that is enough. There are many experiences, and the report says many things about this.
Very much. You've spoken quite about where we were going to head, recommendations for newsrooms. So thank you so much for that. A lot of things stood out for me, especially how you can see how that violence has expanded itself over 10 years. So now this, we're going to our next speaker, Glenda. Rappler started on Facebook, but social media has become very hostile for journalists, especially your CEO, Maria Ressa, and your female reporters, since the Duterte government came to power in 2016. Can you tell us how you've tried to respond to online violence against your staff and how your strategies may have evolved over the past 6 years?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Well, I think it has to be said at the start that Rappler is a female-led newsroom and it's dominated by women. More than 60% of our staff are women. We started on Facebook at a different time, 10 years ago, when social media was really seen as a democratizing force. And fast forward to, in fact, our vision then for Rappler was to use social media for social change. Fast forward to 2016, when Rodrigo Duterte campaigned for the presidency and won eventually, the very platform that Rappler, that enabled Rappler exponential growth was used against us. It's been a tough journey for 1 decade, for that matter. I think most of you could very well relate to the initial reaction of any newsroom to hate and to lies, which is really probably in the early stages of disinformation, to dismiss it, to ignore it, and to say, well, do not feed the trolls. And this was also mentioned in the study. And therefore, we don't need to respond to them. But of course, the problem, as we know now, is much more complicated than that. So the first, initially after that shell shock period of time when we faced the kind of attacks that we had in 2016, we decided to fight back in the manner that we probably know best, which is really to understand and to investigate what exactly is happening behind the posts and behind the network of lies that are being spread all over the country and even beyond the Philippines. So we investigated the network of accounts. We created a small team of researchers focused largely on studying the platform, which is mainly Facebook, because in the Philippines, practically all 90+% of people online are on Facebook. Facebook is unfortunately, our public sphere. It's the oxygen we breathe day in and day out. So a very small unit of Rappler was really focused on studying the disinformation network. We exposed all these network accounts, but beyond writing about them, we really had to take the initiative to talk about them in various fora and to involve all the sectors that are really also victims of disinformation. And we prioritize the academe, we prioritize the student movements and schools in trying to explain to them what we have found out. But parallel to that, of course, is really, we also led social media campaigns to somehow address the kind of disinformation that's being used, not just against Rappler, but against independent media. For example, we launched no space for hate, for example, the Courage on hashtag campaigns. But beyond that, and the most important layer is really that eventually we demanded accountability from Facebook and accountability from all the platforms that enable the kind of disinformation that has attacked journalists. I think if we have to explain the Philippine landscape, which I think most in the global south could relate to, is that I would liken the disinformation attacks, especially against women in the Philippines online, to a kind of information operation that is like a battlefield. And if you allow me, so the reputational attacks are a form of clearing the democratic space of so-called enemies, which in this case, for example, Rappler, which is led by women. It's a machine gun of reputational attacks, but to be able to hold that space, the allies of tyranny, the allies of authoritarianism would like to hold that space online by translating that online hate to our coverage, which is really to limit access to the powers that be, in effect, eventually trying to mute our reporting, trying to silence us. And that has really a cascading effect on our reporters if you are not given access to the public officials you're covering. But beyond that, they did more than that, which is really, and this was enabled by Facebook and social media, because then it created the environment that tended to justify limiting press access to public officials, because Philippine media and Rappler and independent journalists were branded with three things consistently: that independent media is corrupt, that independent media is biased, and that independent media is out to overthrow government. And in particular, because most of our reporters are women, they were subject to tagging online with the words rape, ugly, you look like a man, with all the memes attaching, for example, a policeman's uniform to our women reporters, further delegitimizing us. But what made it worse is really, on top of all this, is the state mobilizing all its resources and weaponizing the law to file cases, not just against our CEO, but against our directors, against our reporters, and against Rappler in particular. So I think how it has evolved is really first from a sense of denial that actually this is systematic and this is sustained, and that this is something that the platforms have enabled. It took years for us to better understand the problem, but now we are in a position to actually not just engage the platforms such as Facebook, but to actually build a coalition outside journalism. Because if there's anything that Rappler has learned in fighting this gendered violence against us women, is that we cannot do it alone. Newsrooms cannot do it alone. And therefore, we need sectoral support, a whole of society approach to what is now not just a problem for journalists, but for all the democracy frontliners out there.
All right. Thank you very much. That was that you hit the nail on the head with how systemic the problem is. So now I'm going to speak to Branko. As a male editor, what would you say to other men leading newsrooms around the world about the horrendous threats women journalists in newsrooms are exposed to? How have you tried to protect your staff and fight against this tide of online hate? Yes, you're muted.
It does help if I unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I've been not there in person. I really wish I could have been, but apologies, I had to address you by Zoom. Look, I mean, just before I respond to your question, just to follow up to Excellency Mantilla Falcón's question of men not being in the room. Is Facebook there? Twitter? Instagram? Anybody from social media? Because, you know, we're discussing, you know, essentially what they've done to the humanity, what they're basically doing to journalism as well. In principle, you know, I just, as a matter, is a rule, somebody employs bots and trolls on social media. Is generally not a good person, so that's what I tell my journalists all the time. So I think we are here in a morally strong position. Daily Maverick is 12 years old, has around 100 employees, and what we like to believe it's a place where journalism, humanity, mission, and business meet. I think business is the last, definitely the last thing there. And, you know, what is important for us is that we really care about every employee, and we are built around those values. Vast majority of our staff are women, and the leadership is entirely female, except for me and my business partner, Stili. So we've been just to echo what Glenda said, we've been under attack for the last 10, 12 years, basically, since we started. And that rhythm just became much faster, and amplitudes became much more, dangerous. So a few years ago, we realized this is going to be something that we have to take care of, and we have to take care of it, on a permanent basis. So one of the first things that we did, we employed the services of counselor. So every single member of our staff, male and female, any time of the day and night, they have access to counselor, and they actually use it quite often. I'd say in the last 2 years, probably 60% of our staff had single or multiple sessions with the counselor, and that turned out to be an incredibly good move. It really does help. Another thing that helps is that I'm available, and so is my partner, 24 hours a day to our staff, to our people. We are a flat organization. We organize in such a way that anybody can call any one of us. And, we are there, we're in this thing together, and we are there for them. So, whatever, time of day and night, we are going to drop everything. And many of our other staff are going to drop everything and come to help of any one of us who was in distress. My best investigative journalists and some of our best reporters are female, and by default, the more successful they were, and the greater scoops they managed to ensure, more attacked than they were, and especially on Twitter. So, for quite a while, we've been planning in advance. Basically, as the stories were approaching, we were planning in advance to, ward those threats, and to even ensure that there's no possible real-world attacks. And sometimes it had to actually include omitting bylines. So 5 years ago, we had something called the Gupta Leaks, and we have decided for the entire project that no bylines are going to be published for a single story. So we can protect the identities of specific individuals writing specific stories and exposing specific players in this whole exercise. Protecting journalists also means sending them into the desert on a farm as the big stories approach, because you want them to be physically safe, and you want them to be okay. And anything that needs to be done, we will do it. It also means that you need to rush early hours of the morning to assist your senior journalist whose house has been broken into by the police crime intelligence, which happened to us last year. So it's really important that we are providing emotional support, but we're also providing physical support to them as well. Most of the time, and I know this sounds simplistic, and most of the time, just letting them know that they're not alone and we care actually goes a long way. It really helps. It's really important, and it's important for them to understand is that, unlike many other publications that you just mentioned, I don't care about those reputational issues and disrepute. Today's world is polarized, and to be honest, we are comfortable with a moral compass, and we are absolutely positive that no one should be left behind, no matter how uncomfortable for us and for our company and for everything that we do. You want to say something?
Yeah, just to add to that, it's clear that the Daily Maverick knows a thing or two about this, and we wanted to show just a clip from the film that you guys produced on the abuse of women journalists in the newsroom.
Yes, please.
When I started in journalism and when Twitter became a thing, we were encouraged to tweet.
It was a medium to tell a story in a different way and maybe to a different audience, or to get the attention and lead someone to your link.
If you want to know things first, if you want to know what people are thinking, it was the place to be. On one Sunday morning, a flood of these awfully manufactured images of me, or distorted images of me, and they were fast. They came very quickly.
I was looking at my phone and it was pinging blue, but it was pinging so fast that I had to sort of look very carefully.
They had a very concerted campaign, and they chose some of us to attack.
Behind it is to dehumanize you. It's to make you seem less human, so that it's okay to attack this person.
The fact of the matter is that they are very influential.
And the next thing I received an SMS, and it said, Miss Curly, those guns are going to be used on your head, at your mother's house, on your dog.
That's direct. That's not anonymous. Might be anonymous. No, they know your phone number. A break-in at your house is direct. These are real threats.
This has happened, it is happening, and the selfish part of it is, when is that going to happen to me? When is that going to happen to one of my colleagues?
Thanks very much, Kiki. I'm just going to wrap up very quickly because we've got very limited time left. But just to say that one of the extraordinary women we saw in that clip is Pauli van Wyk, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Pauli. She told us... Thank you, Branko is always ready to correct. But she told us in the course of this study that she was threatened with being shot in the pussy. I mean, this is the kind of threat that she endures at a prolific level. And she also told us that she would not be practicing journalism today if it was not for her male editor, Branko. And so I just want to pay tribute to that. I think it's really important to acknowledge. We need male allies, as we've heard multiple times during this conference, and that's from the newsroom to the UN level. And the final point to make is that this big study, which we've been working on for 2.5 years now, was due to be published today. Unfortunately, we were unable to publish the full book, but we've published these 2 chapters. But please do stay tuned, because UNESCO is hoping very much to publish in the next couple of months. The obvious disruptions in the context of Ukraine are very relevant to this situation. So solidarity is so vital. Research informing the responses is so vital. But just one final optimistic note to end on. There's an example from Canada where news organisations have come together and they have held conferences, they're staging mediated conversations, they're working on policies together, they're putting out statements to support one another's journalism, journalists when they're under attack. And I think that's worth looking at and thinking about in terms of how we can collectively, as journalists, as news organisations, and as civil society groups, come together. Thank you very much, Kiki.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in online and here physically. Thank you to the amazing speakers. So we're just going to wrap this quickly. I think we can take a group photo because Carmen has to hop off to another panel real quick. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Muchas gracias, todos.